That evening, after another long day at school, Maya went to Mrs. Davis's house. She was feeling a mix of emotions, and as soon as she walked in, Mrs. Davis greeted her with a warm hug. "I missed you today, dear," Mrs. Davis said softly. Maya smiled, feeling the comfort of Mrs. Davis's familiar presence. "I missed you too," she replied, sitting down at the table. Mrs. Davis made tea, and they sat together, talking about their day. But as Maya listened to Mrs. Davis's stories, her mind kept wandering back to Clara and her demand. "Choose between me or Mrs. Davis." Maya felt torn. She loved Mrs. Davis like family, but she didn't want to lose Clara either. Mrs. Davis seemed to understand that something was on Maya's mind. "What's bothering you, Maya?" she asked gently. Maya hesitated. She didn't want to hurt Mrs. Davis's feelings, but she had to tell her. "Clara said I have to choose. If I want to stay friends with her, I can't spend so much time with you." Mrs. Davis looked down, her eyes filled with understanding. "Maya, my dear, you don't have to choose. You deserve to have friends who care about you, no matter their age. But remember, true friends will never ask you to choose between them and someone who cares for you." Maya nodded, her heart heavy. Mrs. Davis's words comforted her, but it still hurt. She had spent so much time with Clara lately, and now it felt like she was losing a friend. The next day, as Maya walked to school, she thought about everything that had happened. She thought about Mrs. Davis, the kindness she had shown her, and the times they had spent together. She thought about Clara and her cold, distracted family life. The decision seemed clearer now. At lunch, Clara walked up to Maya with a smile. "So, have you made up your mind yet?" Clara asked, her voice a little too bright. Maya looked Clara in the eyes. "I have," she said softly. "I'm not going to stop seeing Mrs. Davis. She's been there for me, and I can't just leave her behind." Clara's face changed. For a moment, she looked surprised, and then something else crossed her face. A hint of disappointment, but also a trace of understanding. "Okay," she said quietly, "if that's what you want." Maya felt a sense of relief, but also sadness. She wasn't sure if Clara would ever understand, but she knew she had made the right choice. She didn't need to sacrifice the people who truly cared for her just to fit in. Days turned into weeks, and Maya continued to spend time with Mrs. Davis. They shared more stories, laughed over tea, and even worked on a new baking project. With every visit, Maya felt closer to Mrs. Davis. She began to understand that friendship wasn't about age or fitting in. It was about connection, kindness, and support. One day, Mrs. Davis smiled at Maya and said, "You know, dear, true friends are those who make you feel seen, heard, and valued. Never forget that." Maya smiled back, feeling the truth in Mrs. Davis's words. And though Clara had distanced herself, Maya didn't feel sad anymore. She had learned that the best kind of friendship didn't come with conditions. Maya made other friends at school, kids who liked her for who she was. And every day, she still visited Mrs. Davis. Together, they laughed, baked cookies, and shared stories. Maya learned to appreciate the things that truly mattered in life: love, understanding, and the joy of true friendship. Weeks passed after Maya made her decision. At school, she didn't see much of Clara anymore. When Clara walked into the classroom, she would glance at Maya, but there was no longer the same spark in her eyes. Maya felt a pang of sadness, but she knew in her heart that she had done the right thing. Clara had not tried to reach out, and Maya felt the space between them grow wider. But Maya wasn't upset. She had learned that true friends didn't make you choose between them and the people who cared about you. And that's what made her feel at peace with her decision. Most days after school, Maya would rush to Mrs. Davis's house, eager to see her and share her day. The warmth of Mrs. Davis's home had become a safe place for her, and no matter how hard her day was, the moment she stepped into Mrs. Davis's kitchen, she felt better. One afternoon, Maya arrived to find Mrs. Davis sitting by the window, her knitting needles clicking gently. The sun shone through the window, casting a soft glow on the room. "Hello, dear," Mrs. Davis greeted her with a smile, her voice full of warmth. "How was your day?" "It was good," Maya said, sitting at the table. "But I'm starting to realize something." Mrs. Davis set down her knitting and gave Maya her full attention. "What's that?" I think I was trying too hard to fit in with Clara," Maya said, her voice thoughtful. "She's nice, but now that I've spent more time with you, I realize how much I value the time we have together." Mrs. Davis smiled gently, her eyes crinkling with kindness. "Maya, my dear, true friends will always accept you for who you are, and you don't need to change yourself for anyone, especially not someone who doesn't truly understand what friendship is." Maya nodded, her heart lightening. She had been so focused on fitting in with Clara that she had forgotten the most important thing: being herself. With Mrs. Davis, she didn't have to pretend to be anyone else. She could be honest, silly, serious, or shy, and Mrs. Davis would still care for her. That was real friendship. One afternoon, as Maya was walking home from school, she saw Clara sitting alone on a bench by the park. Maya's first instinct was to walk away. After all, they hadn't spoken much in weeks, and the silence between them had become comfortable. But then, something tugged at Maya's heart. She remembered the good times they'd had before everything changed, and she knew that the door to friendship could still be open if Clara was ready to walk through it. Maya hesitated for a moment, then walked over to Clara, who looked up as she approached. "Hi, Clara," Maya said, her voice soft but friendly. Clara looked surprised, but she smiled a little. "Hey, Maya," she said, her tone quieter than usual. Maya sat down next to her. The silence between them was heavy at first, but Maya didn't mind. She knew that sometimes it took time for people to find their way back to each other. After a few moments, Clara spoke up. "I've been thinking," she said slowly. "I'm sorry for what I said before. I shouldn't have made you choose between me and Mrs. Davis. I didn't understand what she meant to you." Maya looked at Clara, surprised by her apology. "It's okay," she said. "I know you were just trying to help me fit in, but I've realized that I don't need to change who I am for anyone. Mrs. Davis has always been there for me, and she cares about me in a way no one else does." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "I get it now. I guess I was just lonely too. My family is always so busy, and sometimes it feels like I don't matter. But I shouldn't have tried to make you feel the same way." Maya smiled warmly at Clara. "You do matter, Clara. You just need people who care about you, and you don't have to be alone." The two girls sat there for a while, talking quietly about their lives. Clara admitted how hard it was to feel disconnected from her family, and Maya shared how comforting it had been to have Mrs. Davis as a friend. They talked about everything and nothing, and for the first time in a long while, Maya felt like she was reconnecting with Clara, not as someone who wanted to be popular or cool, but as someone who wanted a true friend. The next few days brought a shift in Maya and Clara's relationship. Clara began to understand that friendship wasn't about fitting into a mold. It was about connection. Clara started to spend more time with Maya, but she also made an effort to spend time with her family. She realized that being close to her family was just as important as having friends. One afternoon, Clara invited Maya over to her house. This time, things felt different. Clara's family was sitting around the dinner table, laughing and talking as if they had all found something they'd been missing. Clara introduced Maya to her younger brother and sister, and Maya was surprised to see them all laughing together. There was warmth in the room now, something Maya had never noticed before. "I'm glad you're here," Clara's mother said, smiling at Maya. "We don't get many visitors." Maya smiled back. "I'm glad to be here." Later that evening, when they were alone in Clara's room, Clara turned to Maya. "Thanks for sticking with me," she said quietly. "I didn't realize how much I needed to understand what real friendship was. I think I'm starting to get it now." Maya nodded. feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. She had been true to herself, and that had made all the difference. She had stayed true to her friendship with Mrs. Davis, and now she could see that things were starting to heal with Clara, too. As the months went by, Maya's life in the small town became richer. She had learned so much from both Clara and Mrs. Davis. Her bond with Mrs. Davis had deepened, and together they continued to share stories and laughter. Mrs. Davis had even taught Maya how to make her favorite pie, and they spent long afternoons in the kitchen, talking about everything and nothing. At school, Maya and Clara began to hang out more, but this time it was different. There were no more demands or expectations. They enjoyed each other's company without feeling the need to prove anything. Clara had grown more connected with her family, and Maya had found other friends who appreciated her for who she truly was. One afternoon, as Maya walked home with Clara, they stopped in front of Mrs. Davis's house. Mrs. Davis was sitting on her porch, knitting a scarf. She waved at them, and they both waved back. "Do you want to go in?" Maya asked Clara. Clara smiled, and for the first time, Maya saw a true warmth in her eyes. "I'd love to," Clara said. The three of them spent the afternoon together, sipping tea and sharing stories. Maya realized that, in the end, she didn't have to choose between two worlds. She had found a balance between the friendship she had with Mrs. Davis and the new connection she was building with Clara. In that moment, Maya understood something important about friendship. It wasn't about age or status. It was about being there for each other, no matter the differences. And with that, Maya knew she had everything she needed. The end of this chapter